Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from RAU'S IAS Study Circle.
Welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the newspaper dated 9th July 2022. And the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion. This article on page number 6 talks about the shadow war that is ongoing between Israel and Iran in West Asia. Now, West Asia has always been a theater of geopolitical action where different countries have been pursuing their different goals. For example, this region is known for the geopolitical rivalry which has underlying currents of religious demography of this region. In this, there are three poles, one led by Jewish Israel, one led by Arab countries which are mainly Sunni dominated monarchies, as well as Iran, which is a Shia dominated theocratic republic. Further, the West Asian geopolitics is also complicated because of interference of external powers, for example, the United States of America, as well as Russia and China. And all these have impact on India's approach towards the West Asia also. However, in this discussion, we'll focus on the background of the geopolitics of West Asia and how the geopolitics in West Asia has shaped up, particularly after the Second World War, and what have been the important events in the past that have shaped the geopolitics of the West Asian region. Now, although this discussion might not be directly important for us from the exam perspective, but it will be very useful in understanding the geopolitics of West Asia, and after that, you will be able to understand how India has managed its relations with the various countries in the region. We are aware that India has had good relations with Palestine in the past since the independence. Further, India has had good relations with the Arab countries owing to its oil demand. And of late, India is developing good relations with Israel. Further, India also has had good relations with Iran, claiming to be civilizational ties, and also Iran has been one of the important partners for India for providing oil. And also, Iran is crucial for India's connectivity projects to Central Asia as well as landlocked Afghanistan, which is crucial for India's security. And that is why understanding the geopolitics of West Asia is very important to understand how the politics has shaped India's approach towards this West Asian region. So if you look at the map of the West Asian region, there are three important poles. One led by the Arab countries, which is led by the Saudi Arabian monarchy. The other that is led by Israel, which is the Jewish state that was created after 1945, that is after the Second World War. And then there is Iran, which is a Shia-led country and is a theocratic republic. Now, in this line, there has always been rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran for regional hegemony because this world is dominated by Muslims and both these countries want to have their dominance over the Muslim countries of the region. Further, Israel, which was created after the 1945 and was carved out of the Palestinian territory which was under the British control, the Arab countries have always fought wars with Israel. However, now the situation is changing. In this context, let us try and understand what has shaped the geopolitics of West Asia event by event. So when the Second World War got over, the decolonization process had also started. And in this line, the British was withdrawing from the Palestinian territory near the Mediterranean borders. However, when the British was withdrawing from this particular territory, the UN had passed a partition plan of the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And accordingly, when the British withdrew from this territory of Palestine, in line with the UN's partition plan, Israel declared its independence. And this was a Jewish state that was created from the Palestinian territory. In this line, the Western world had sympathy with Israel because the Jewish people were the ones who were at the receiving end of the hatred that was unleashed under the Hitler's regime in Germany. And there was widespread discrimination and they were put into the concentration camps during the Second World War. And that is why the Western world had the sympathy towards the Jewish population. And that is why these countries supported the United Nations' plan of partitioning the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state so that the statehood aspirations of the Jewish could be addressed. However, this creation of Israel in the Palestinian territory, which is in the center of the Arab world, was not taken well by the Arab countries. And accordingly, these Arab countries have fought continuous wars with Israel. And three of the famous wars that Arab countries and Israel have fought are the 1956 war, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. In October of 1956, in the First War, Israel invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. In the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel captured three of important strategic territories. One was on its northern borders, that is known as the Golan Heights from Syria. Second was Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and it also took control of the Gaza Strip, which is claimed as the Palestinian territory. And the third war that was fought between the Arab countries and Israel was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. In this war, Syrian forces attacked Israel from the northern sides along the Golan Heights, while the Egyptian forces attacked Israel from the southern side along the Sinai Peninsula. However, Israel emerged victorious. So we can clearly see that the Arab-Israel rivalry has been one of the important issues in the geopolitics of West Asia that started because of the creation of Israel from the Arabic Palestinian territory, which was under the control of the British. However, this Arab-Jewish rivalry is witnessing thaw since the Yom Kippur War. And in this line, in 1979, Israel and the Egyptians signed a peace treaty. This was followed by Jordan, and in 1994, Israel and Jordan signed an agreement for peace. And only as late as 2020, Abraham Accords have been finalized between Israel and UAE, and which was mediated by the United States of America. And both these countries have agreed to establish full diplomatic relations after 70 years of rivalry. But there is another twist in this story of the geopolitics of West Asia, and that is the story of Iran and how the Iran has changed since the Second World War. So one of the defining moments of the West Asian geopolitics was the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Now before 1979, Iran was ruled by the Pahlavi dynasty under the Shah Muhammad Raza Pahlavi, and he was an important ally of the United States of America. Now since the Shah dynasty was an ally of the United States of America, it was naturally a very good friend of Israel as well. However, a revolution happened in Iran which overthrew the regime of the Pahlavi dynasty, and the Shah fled the country. And after that, a theocratic republic was established in Iran, which was Shia-dominated regime. And this again started the Sunni-Shia rivalry in the West Asian region. And this revolution moved Iran, one of the natural powers in the region in terms of resource, geography and population, from being an American ally to its top enemy. And an Iran dominated by Shia under the theocratic regime was also seen as a threat to the Sunni Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc. And that is why a proxy war, or you can say a cold war, has started between the Sunni-led countries as well as the Shia countries in the West Asian region. So this brings us to the next important rivalry of the region, that is Saudi-Iran rivalry. Now this rivalry is not just a rivalry between two countries. It is also a religious rivalry because the Saudi Arabia is a Sunni-dominated country while Iran is a Shia-dominated country. And that is why there are religious undertones in the geopolitics of West Asia, where one pole is Israel, which is a Jewish state. The Arab countries are mostly Sunni-dominated countries, while Iran is a Shia-dominated countries. And all three have had rivalry with each other. We initially saw the Arab-Israel rivalry, and now we are seeing the Saudi-Iran or the Arab-Iran rivalry. Now this basically is an ongoing struggle for influence in the Middle Eastern region and the Muslim regions between Iran, that is Shia Iran, and the Sunni Saudi Arabia. It is basically a quest for regional hegemony where one wants to rule over the other, or one wants to have its influence considerably over the Muslim countries of this particular region. And that is why a proxy war had started after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when the US-backed monarchy in the state of Israel was replaced by an Islamic republic that was Shia-dominated. Now this rivalry has also been visible in some of the theaters of action in the West Asia. We all are aware that the Yemen war is ongoing. In this, the Houthi rebels are against the ruling government of Yemen. Now these Houthi rebels have been supported by Iran, that is Shia Iran, and they have been fighting against the ruling government of Yemen, which has been supported by the Sunni Saudi Arabia. So this proxy war is visible in different theaters of action in West Asia, a prime example of that being Yemen war. Now before the 1979 revolution, both Saudi Arabia and Iran were good allies of the United States of America. And this was primarily because of one of the doctrines of the United States of America, that was twin pillar policy in the Middle East, where US had good relations with Saudi Arabia as well as Iran. And US had good relations with Iran primarily because the Shah was an ally of the United States of America. However, after the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah was removed and a theocratic state had been established in Iran, the US's relation with the Iran worsened. And this brings us to next important rivalry, that is what has been the rivalry between Israel and Iran. Now this Israel-Iran rivalry has also started after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and that is why it is said that the 1979 revolution was one of the turning points in the history of geopolitics of West Asia. Because before the Iranian Revolution, Israel, which is also an ally of the United States of America, had good relations with Iran. However, after the revolution of Iran, it turned out to be one of the biggest rivals of Israel in the region. And this is clearly visible from this particular example, where before the Iranian Revolution, Israel was planning to provide nuclear weapons to Iran. However, once the Shah regime was toppled and the theocratic state was established in Iran, the Israel tried to stop the Iran's nuclear program and also tried to sabotage its nuclear program. Now, after looking at the rivalries that have been ongoing in the West Asian region since the Second World War, we also need to understand what has been the geopolitical competition in this region since the Second World War during the Cold War. So that is why the US and the Russia, they have been present in this region, especially in the context of the Cold War. And that is why the United States of America's policy in the region was primarily in order to contain the spread of communism and also to contain the spread of the influence of the erstwhile USSR, which is presently Russia. And accordingly, in order to contain the spread of the erstwhile USSR's influence, US pursued a policy of having its considerable influence in the West Asian region. And that is why the US had good relations with Saudi Arabia. In this line, the US also improved its relations with Saudi Arabia ever since the discovery of crude oil in Saudi Arabia in 1938. Further, US has had good relations with Israel owing to the influential Jewish population in the US itself. And also, the United States of America had good relations with Shah of Iran till the revolution that took place in Iran in 1979. However, post the Iranian Revolution, the policy of the United States of America has been to contain Iran. So we have seen that the US had considerable presence in this region since the Second World War, primarily in order to contain the USSR during the Cold War. And that is why we see here that the US had pursued good relations with Saudi Arabia, Israel, as well as Iran. However, as we see that the policy of the United States of America changed considerably after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and that is why in 2020, the United States of America mediated the Abraham Accords to reduce the rivalry between the Arab countries as well as Israel. And because of the Abraham Accords, the Arab-Israel relations are improving, mediated by the United States of America to create a common front to stop Iran in order to contain its nuclear program. So this brings us to the present context where the Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons. And the Iran has considerably invested in its nuclear program since the last 20 to 25 years. However, both US and Israel have tried to sabotage the Iran's nuclear program. In this line, Israel has carried out covert operations inside Iran targeting its nuclear as well as missile programs. And Israel killed the head of the Iranian nuclear program only last year. Further, Iran, as a response to this, has been undertaking various drone attacks, famous being the attacks on the Saudi Arabian oil facility Aramco and also in the UAE. Plus, also Iran has been targeting the Israel's presence in some of the neighboring countries like Iraq and Syria. And this clearly highlights that the policy of all the countries of the region, including the United States of America, has been to contain the Iran's nuclear program. And that is why there is a consensus amongst the West Asia's anti-Iran axis, that is between the US, Israel and the Gulf kingdoms, that Iran's nuclear program should be scuttled. And if Iran achieves the nuclear capabilities, it could alter the region's balance of power, which is presently in favor of Israel because Israel is the only nuclear state in this region. That is, it is the only state having the nuclear bomb capacity. And this provides considerable advantage to the Israel, which would not exist if Iran acquires nuclear weapons. And that is why the policy of US, the Gulf kingdoms and the Israel has been to contain the Iran's nuclear program. In this line, after trying for long to contain the Iran's nuclear program, the Obama administration in 2015 signed a nuclear agreement with Iran that was termed as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, under the Obama administration, the P5 countries of the United Nations Security Council as well as Germany signed this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was also approved by the United Nations. Now, under this JCPOA, the Iran's nuclear facilities were kept under the surveillance of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And after the finalization of the JCPOA, the economic sanctions on Iran were removed slowly. However, even after the finalization of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which tried to control the Iran's nuclear program, the Gulf countries, the Gulf kingdoms, and Israel were not very happy. This was because, in return for complying with the JCPOA for Iran and stopping or controlling its nuclear program, it would still reduce or remove the sanctions on Iran, which will ultimately lead to the rise of Iran. And that is why the Israel and the Gulf kingdoms were not happy with the JCPOA, because in return for limiting Iran's nuclear program, the JCPOA agreement promised economic rewards to the Islamic Republic, which could transform Iran into a non-nuclear conventional as well as mainstream power in West Asia, which will challenge the presence of the Arabic or the Gulf kingdoms as well as Israel. And that is why both these camps, one Israel, the other led by the Gulf kingdoms, were not happy with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And accordingly, Israel's concerns were taken into account by the United States of America under the Donald Trump administration. And accordingly, the US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal under the Donald Trump administration under a policy that is pursued by the United States of America, and that is the policy of maximum pressure on Iran. And under this policy of maximum pressure, the United States of America wanted to isolate Iran and make it bleed economically so that it can come to terms and talk about reducing or eliminating its nuclear program altogether. Now, as a response, Iran has been carrying out attacks on Saudi Arabia, UAE, as well as it has been supporting the proxies like Houthis in Yemen. And this brings us to what is the present status of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In this line, under the new president Joe Biden, the US again started talks over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in Vienna. However, the talks are still stuck for the revival of the JCPOA after the US had withdrawn under the Donald Trump administration. In this line, US now wants stronger control over the Iran's nuclear program. And the talks were stuck over one of the key issues, and that was the US's refusal to undo the Donald Trump's decision of designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC as a terrorist group. So Donald Trump administration had designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is also the military of the Iran, as a terrorist group. And that is why Iran wants that this designation should be removed. Only then the talks can resume and go forward. However, as far as Israel is concerned, Israel wants to scuttle the Iran's nuclear program. It wants to delimitate its military program and build a stronger region-wide defenses against its proxies, and at the same time contain the rise of Iran altogether. So this has been the policy of Israel, which wants to control or contain Iran through different point of views. That is by reducing its military strength, eliminating its nuclear program, as well as building strong region-wide defenses against the proxies like the Iran's support to Houthis, etc. And that is why Israel is aligning with the Gulf monarchies to create this common front to control Iran in any future conflict. And according to this thought, the Abraham Accords were finalized by the mediation of the United States of America. And this strategy of Israel elevates the Israel's role as a new security provider in the Gulf at a time when the US is preoccupied with its priorities elsewhere, including Ukraine as well as Indo-Pacific. However, there is one important threat that is looming large, and that is Iran, because of the failure of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iranian nuclear deal as it is called. It has started enriching weapons-grade uranium, which can become a future threat in the West Asia. Now, as far as India's policy towards West Asia is concerned, it is highlighted by 3-4 broad contours. And if you look at the importance of West Asian region to India, primarily this region is very important for India because India is dependent on crude oil imports from the countries of this region, because this region has the highest crude oil resources. Further, in this line, If you look at India's stand towards the Israel-Palestinian conflict, India always supported the Palestinian cause owing to its own colonial past. In this line, the Palestinian issue also started because of the withdrawal of the British, and it did not pay heed to the statehood cause of the Palestinian people. And also, under its policy of solidarity with the decolonized countries, India has always supported the Palestinian cause since the Cold War, even till date. Further, India has tried to balance its relations between the Iran Arab rivalry, which primarily started after the Iranian Revolution. Now, this is primarily because of India's dependency on West Asia for crude oil demand. And that is why India has tried to pursue cordial relations with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and all these countries in this particular region without taking sides in the Cold War in the region. Further, as far as India's relations with Israel are concerned, initially India did not support Israel. However, of late, India is trying to dehyphenate its policy towards Israel-Palestinian conflict. In this line, India is still supporting the Palestinian cause of statehood. However, now India has improved its relations with Israel. This is because the situation of India and Israel is almost similar. That is, both are surrounded by hostile neighborhood. And that is why both are now aligning in terms of security arrangements and military preparedness. Plus also, Israel is emerging as one of the exporters of defense equipment to India. Further, as far as Iran is concerned, India's relations with Iran have been crucial for oil imports as well as connectivity projects into Afghanistan and Central Asia via the Chabahar port. And that is why India has also pursued cordial relations with Iran. However, India's relations with Iran and especially the crude oil imports were impacted when the United States of America withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and sanctions were imposed on Iran. And further, as we are seeing a thaw in the Israel-Arab relations because of the finalization of the Abraham Accord mediated by the United States of America, there is possibility of formation of West Asian Quad, which was talked about last year when the foreign ministers of all these four countries met. And the members of the West Asian Quad will be United States of America, Israel, UAE, and India. So in this discussion, we have taken an overview of the West Asian geopolitics, what are stakes for India, what are the important rivalries in the region, and also what are the present ongoing issues. Now, although all of them might not be important for us directly from the exam perspective, but they are very important for us to understand India's approach towards this region and also to understand India's foreign policy towards this region. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This article on page number 1 and page number 3 is basically related to the split that has happened in the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra, which has led to the fall of the Uddhav Thackeray government and which has led to the formation of the government led by Eknath Shinde, who is leading one of the factions of the Shiv Sena. In this line, the present government in case of Maharashtra has proved its majority on the floor because of the support of the MLAs from the Shiv Sena led by the Eknath Shinde. In this line, both the factions which are led by Eknath Shinde as well as Uddhav Thackeray have asserted that they claim the party symbol of Shiv Sena. And that is how the matter now rests with the Election Commission of India, which is empowered under the paragraph 15 of the Election Symbols Reservation and Allotment Order 1968 to decide in cases of splits of factions from a particular party. Further, there are Conduct of Rules 1967 that were brought out by the Election Commission of India, which empowers it to specify symbols for elections in parliamentary and assembly constituencies. Now, Shiv Sena is a state party as recognized by the Election Commission of India. In this line, let us understand what are the powers to the Election Commission of India under the paragraph 15 of the Election Symbols Order 1968 and also Rule 5 of the Conduct of Election Rules 1961. In this line, the paragraph 15 of the Election Symbols Order 1968 provides the power of the Commission in relation to splinter groups or rival sections of a recognized political party. In this line, the rival factions or the splinter groups will submit their claims to the party symbol to the Election Commission of India. Now, Election Commission of India, after taking into account all the available facts and circumstances of the case and hearing both the sides or the splinter groups, may decide that one rival faction will be authorized to use the party symbol and none of the factions are authorized to use this same party symbol. In this line, the decision of the Commission shall be binding on all such rival sections or groups. So this highlights that although the power to decide upon this particular issue or conflict has been provided to the Election Commission of India, however, there are no rules or precedents which can be used by the Election Commission of India to decide upon which section to be provided with party name and party symbol. Further, the Rule 5 of the Conduct of the Elections provide that symbols for the election in parliamentary and assembly constituencies which can be provided. In this line, the Election Commission of India shall by notification in the Gazette of India and in the official gazette of each state specify the symbols that may be chosen by the candidates at the election in parliamentary or assembly constituencies and their restrictions to which their choice shall be subject. So this is also one of the rule which is used by the Election Commission of India to specify the symbols that can be chosen by the candidates at elections in parliamentary level or at assembly level. In this context, let us also understand what are the conditions for the recognition of a party as a state party. In this line, there are 5 conditions that have been outlined by the Election Commission of India. And any party which seeks to be recognized as a state party need to fulfill at least one condition of these 5 conditions that have been provided by the Election Commission of India. The first is that at the last general elections to the State Legislative Assembly, a party which secures not less than 6% of the total valid votes and wins at least 2 seats in the State Legislative Assembly. So this is the first condition. Second condition is at last general election to the Lok Sabha from that particular state, a party which secures not less than 6% of the total valid votes polled in that state and wins at least 1 seat in the Lok Sabha election from that state. Further, the third condition is that at the last general election to the State Legislative Assembly, a party which wins at least 3% of the total number of the seats in the Legislative Assembly or at least 3 seats in the Legislative Assembly, whichever is more. Further, the fourth condition is that at the last general election to the Lok Sabha from that particular state, a party which wins at least 1 for every 25 seats from a state in Lok Sabha election. And the fifth condition is that a political party which secures at least 8% of the total valid votes polled in that state. And to be recognized as a state party, a particular political party will have to meet any one of these 5 conditions. So these are the 5 conditions which can be important for us from prelims examination perspective. Then there are conditions for a party to be recognized as a national party. In this line, any party which secures at least 6% of the valid vote in an assembly or Lok Sabha general elections in any 4 or more states and has won at least 4 seats in Lok Sabha general election from any state or the states. Further, second condition is that it wins at least 2% of the Lok Sabha seats and these seats must be won from 3 different states. And finally, a party that is recognized as a state party in at least 4 states. So if a party meets any of these conditions, the party can be recognized as a national party. In this line, the Law Commission of India in its 255th report has highlighted certain reforms related to political parties. And these reforms can be important for us from the mains examination perspective. So let us look at these reforms also because they are also related to the conduct of the political parties. First is that the Law Commission has recommended that there should be introduction of internal democracy and transparency within the political parties because it is important to promote financial and electoral accountability, reduce corruption, and improve the democratic functioning of the country as a whole. We all are aware that the political parties are the important pillars of the representative democracy, and that is why internal democracy and transparency within the political parties is of utmost importance. Second is that the Election Commission should be given the power to deregister such political parties which avail the benefits of income tax exemption under the Section 13A of the Income Tax Act but have not contested any parliamentary or state elections in the 10 consecutive years because this is used as one of the ways of siphoning off the black money. And that is why Election Commission should be given the power to deregister such political parties. Further, the Law Commission in its report recommends that the power of the Election Commission of India should extend to the regulation of action and not ideology of the political parties. Further, the Law Commission recommends amendment to the Section 29A5 of the Representation of the People Act 1951. And it requires parties to insert a specific provision in their memorandum to shun violence for political gains and avoid discrimination or distinction based on race, caste, creed, language, or place of residence. So all these provisions should be included by amending the section 29A5 of the Representation of People Act 1951. And finally, a new part 4B, which should be titled as Regulation of the Political Parties, should be added to the Representation of People Act 1951. So these are some of the reforms that have been suggested by the Law Commission of India in its 255th report. And we have seen what are the powers of the Election Commission of India to decide upon such disputed cases of claims towards the party symbols. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This editorial on page number 6 is related to handling of the prevailing heat wave conditions in India. In this context, let us try and understand what is meant by heat wave, what is the criteria for identifying a heat wave, and what are the conditions that lead to heat wave like situation. So if you look at heat wave, this is basically a period of abnormally high temperatures which are more than the normal maximum temperature that occurs during the summer season in the northwestern parts of India. Now such heat wave conditions can also exist in the other parts of India also. Now these heat waves typically occur between the month of March and June, and in some rare cases they even extend till July. And the extreme temperature and resultant atmospheric conditions adversely affect people living in these regions, as they can cause physiological stress and sometimes they can result into death. So what is the criteria for identifying a heat wave? In this line, the Indian Meteorological Department has outlined a particular criteria. Let us look at that criteria. In this line, the IMD says that there are two conditions which need to be satisfied. First is that a heat wave is considered if the maximum temperature of a station reaches 40 degrees centigrade or more for the plain area, 37 degree or more for coastal stations, and 30 degree or more for hilly regions. In this line, this criteria can be used for declaring a heat wave. First is based on departure from normal temperature. In this line, a heat wave when there is departure from the normal temperature and it is about 4.5 degree to 6.4 degree centigrade. So let's say if a region witnesses average temperature of about 20 degrees centigrade and the temperature has departed from this particular normal to 24.5 to 26.4, then it will be considered as a heat wave. Then there is criteria of declaring a severe heat wave also, where the departure from the normal temperature is about 6.4 degrees centigrade. Further, it can also be based on actual maximum temperature for plains only. In this line, a heat wave can be declared when actual maximum temperature for the plains is 45 degrees centigrade, and a severe heat wave when the actual maximum temperature is about 47 degrees centigrade. And in this line, the above criteria should be met at least 2 stations in the meteorological subdivision for at least 2 consecutive days, and the heat wave will be declared on the second day. So this is the criteria that has been identified by the Indian Meteorological Department to declare a heat wave. Now what are the conditions that lead to the formation of heat waves? Now this include transportation or prevalence of hot dry air over a region. Now there should be a region of warm dry air and appropriate flow pattern for transportation of hot air over a particular region. Second is absence of moisture in the upper atmosphere. This is because the presence of moisture restricts the temperature. Third is the sky should be practically cloudless because it will allow maximum insulation over the region and also leads to the formation of heat wave like condition. Further, there should be large amplitude anticyclonic flow over the area. In this line, the heat waves generally develop over the northwestern part of India, and from there on, they spread gradually eastwards and southwards. However, from there, they do not move westward. This is primarily because of the prevailing winds during the summer season, which are westerly to northwesterly. But there are also some conditions in which the heat wave may also develop over any region in situ under the favorable conditions. So these are certain conditions which lead to the formation of the heat waves, and you can use these conditions to write about the conditions which are favorable for the formation of a heat wave. With this, let's take up the next news article now. With this, we conclude today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.